He sat in a small apartment that still looked like someone had left it in a hurry, a mug on the counter, a jacket folded over a chair, a plant that had gone a week without water. The silence in that room was not the polite absence of sound. It was a pressure. It pressed on his ribs the way a hand presses words down into the throat. He had lost everything in silence. The job that had defined him, the partner who had been the string to his kite, the steady rhythm of weekday life. There had been no dramatic scene, no shouting, no courtroom turbulence, no public falling. The losses arrived and then folded into the quiet like an uninvited guest who never left. He told no one the magnitude of the unraveling. He wore his emptiness like a coat too heavy to remove. This is his story, but it is also instruction. It's the story of why he remained stuck long after the facts changed, and how quietly and steadily he rebuilt himself from the inside out. We will look at the science of why pain stays alive, and we will watch him practice the small, repeatable things that loosen that grip. This isn't about magical cures. It's about pacing, nervous system work, honest restoring, and the slow work of reclaiming an identity that isn't hostage to an old wound. If this message finds you in a corner of your life that feels paused or frozen, download the Letting Go toolkit linked below, tools you can try gently, and a weekly inventory to track small, real progress. He called himself Michael in the first session with the man who would become his steady presence, a coach with a background in trauma-informed work, a calm voice and hands that rested lightly on the table as if grounding his own nervous system. He rarely raised his voice. When he explained things, he did so in plain sentences. The body remembers what words forget, he said. When you say, "I'm fine," the chest may say otherwise. Michael's days after the loss were built of tiny rituals. Waking, scrolling headlines, closing the laptop, staring at the streetlight outside, avoiding calls. At night, he replayed sequences that had long since ended, like a scratched song skipping at the same bar. He could recount the words his partner had used, the inflection of his boss's disappointment, the small gestures that had hinted at decline. These replays were not merely memories. They were moments reactivated and rehearsed. The brain treats repeated rehearsal like a path through grass. Walk it enough, and it becomes the way. You can see the prison without seeing bars. It looks like a kitchen table you avoid. It looks like an email ignored for days. It looks like the way you stop starting things before they begin because you've learned to expect collapse. Attachment theory names this pattern in relationships. Our nervous systems learn to expect threat where they once found safety. John Bowlby's early work described how infants learn to predict the world. As adults, those early predictions can become stubborn habits.
Negativity bias, our brain's preferential attention to harm, keeps rehearsing the threat long after the moment has passed. That's what happened to him. He was not lazy. He was responding to a system designed to protect him by keeping his attention on danger. In the kitchen, his chest would tighten at certain cues. A message tone, the sight of a coworker on the street, a song on the radio, each a tiny hammer on old glass. He learned to hold his breath without thinking, a shallow, anxious ridgeline that left him dizzy and ding. The body's alarm system is brisk and practical. When the amygdala senses threat, it calls for action. The hippocampus tries to place the memory in context. This happened then, not now. But when the alarm is loud and the hippocampus is bypassed, the memory remains live, sensory, and immediate. He learned these names slowly, in moments between appointments. Amygdala, the coach said once, as they sat in a waiting room where sunlight poured across a worn sofa. Hippocampus, vagus nerve. The words were not charms, they were maps. The amygdala flags, the coach said. The hippocampus contextualizes. The vagus is the system that tells your body when it's okay to soften. Stephen Porges' polyvagal ideas were offered not as doctrine, but as a way to notice what happened in his throat and chest, why some sensations called for fight, flight, or freeze, and why some very old alarms no longer matched the actual level of danger. Understanding made space. It did not by itself free him. Knowledge without regulation is like buying a boat without learning how to float it. The coach taught regulation first. He explained that before you go into heavy memory work, the system needs to feel safer. He showed him how a regulated presence could be modeled, the coach's voice slow, the way his hands settled at his sides. The presence itself became a lesson, bodies learn safety by co-regulation. When another person is calm, mirror neurons help tone the nervous system down. This was not about dependence, it was about learning a new pattern of internal signal. Safety begets safety. The hidden prison is not only made of alarming sensations, it is also made of benefits, shadowy payoffs that accrue to staying stuck. There were things gained in his silence. Avoiding social situations shielded him from the embarrassment of being seen as changed. Not committing to anything saved him the risk of failing again. His silence, the capitalized name he sometimes used in his head, kept him small but protected. In the therapist's office, gentle curiosity opened this truth. "What do you get from staying the same?" the coach asked. It wasn't a trick, it was a key. He named the benefits awkwardly at first. Safety, predictability, less chance of being hurt when you were already numb. But naming them didn't make them disappear. The man called these secondary benefits, a word Dr.
Richard Schwartz and many clinicians find helpful to describe the hidden rewards of defensive patterns. Identifying a payoff doesn't mean you justify staying stuck. It simply reveals the trade-off you've unconsciously accepted. Cost and benefit sat together on his inner ledger. The cost was visible. Chronic fatigue, the creak of friendships that thinned into messages never answered, missed interviews, a persistent low-grade dread that made mornings hard to start. The cost was deeper too, a shrinking sense of self. Where he used to imagine himself present in the future, he now pictured a gray continuation of the same smaller life. The question became not just how to stop the alarm, but how to build a new story for himself, a plausible identity that could withstand small defeats. This is where neuroplasticity shows up as possibility. The brain is not fixed, it's open to rewriting. Repeated practice of new patterns builds new pathways, but the practice requires a scaffold. Safety first, then small experiments, then memory updating. Reconsolidation, the process by which a memory becomes malleable and can be updated, offers a mechanism by which the charge around pain can reduce. That process is not magic. It is slow, precise, and must be done with attention to pacing. Research and experienced clinicians suggest that when a memory is briefly reactivated in a safe context, and then a new corrective experience is introduced, the memory's emotional charge can change. This is not a guaranteed cure, and it should be approached cautiously, ideally with trained support if trauma is severe. He started with the body. The first practice he learned was simple in form and strangely demanding in execution: coherent breathing. Not a promise, not a trick, just an invitation to notice the breath and lengthen the exhale until the chest softened. In a small scene on his couch, the man placed one hand over his heart and another over his belly, and inhaled slowly through his nose, feeling the expansion, then extended the exhale a beat longer. The action calmed the alarm bell in his chest. It did not erase the grief, but it took down the volume a notch. When we speak of the vagus nerve sending safety signals, this is the kind of tool that helps the signal travel. Stephen Porges's work frames breath and social engagement as roots into safety. The technique here is a practical micro-route. He practiced coherent breathing repeatedly, at first in private, then at the coach's office, where the coach's regulated presence normalized the rhythm. "You're not doing this to fix yourself," the coach said. "You're doing this to create a baseline where harder work becomes possible." After each breath session, the man noticed small differences: less tightness behind the sternum, a clearer thought, a slackening of the mouth. These were small, but in aggregate, they began to register as signals of safety his body could remember. The next practice was somatic titration. The coach explained it as peerless patience, to touch a painful memory only in the smallest possible increments so the nervous system doesn't get flooded. In a dimly lit room, they sat with a memory he used to avoid, a quiet afternoon when his boss had called him into the office and said words that first eroded his confidence. The coach asked him to bring the memory up just a notch, to name a single sensory detail: the click of the pen, the rustle of a sleeve. He described the detail, held it for a breath, then pivoted to a sensation of safety, a warmth in his hand from the mug, the weight of his body in the chair. He called that alternating process titration: small exposure, then safe return.
Over weeks, the memory loosened, its edges softened. It remained in the file cabinet of his brain, but no longer glared like a siren. The man's mind had been populated by inner characters for as long as he could remember. There was the protector, a stern, quiet voice that monitored risk and pushed for withdrawal. The inner child who wanted sweetness and lit quickly at tenderness. The saboteur who whispered that he didn't deserve recovery. And the witness, a steady presence that could observe without getting hijacked. The coach introduced these parts as neutral actors rather than moral labels. Listen before you argue, he said. In one session, Michael learned to put names to the voices and to let the protector speak its fears while inviting the witness to hold the room. This internal dialogue is sometimes called parts work or internal family systems in clinical circles. It is not a magic bullet, but it gives form to what previously felt like chaotic internal shouting. A careful, patient example. The man found himself awake at 3 a.m., the saboteur loud and convincing. Instead of letting the saboteur run the night, he sat up and whispered back with the witness, "I hear you. You're trying to protect me." He didn't argue. He acknowledged. He offered a small action, making a cup of tea, moving his feet on the rug, breathing in a pattern that soothed, and the form of the internal conversation changed. The protector felt heard and, paradoxically, loosened its grip. These micro-negotiations were not dramatic. They were unglamorous acts of internal diplomacy, repeated. Cognitive restructuring followed. Old beliefs are sticky. He had one that felt like a stone in his chest. "I am broken." That sentence had the power to short-circuit attempts to plan or reach. The coach invited him to treat that belief as a hypothesis rather than an absolute. What evidence supported "I am broken"? What evidence contradicted it? They named survival strategies, ways his older self had adapted and kept him alive. You learned competence in crisis, the coach suggested. You learned to keep relating small losses inside because speaking them out loud felt unsafe. Reframing did not deny the pain. Instead, it contextualized the pain as strategy rather than essence. "I am broken" became in a new register. I learned ways to survive that no longer serve me. Memory reconsolidation was introduced slowly as an advanced tool. The coach explained, in plain terms, that if a memory is activated and then new information contradicts its emotional truth, the brain can update the memory's charge. He described a guided visualization in which the man would bring a specific memory into mind, allow its image to appear briefly, then introduce a corrective feeling or perspective, something small that provided evidence the old meaning was no longer entirely correct. This was not an attempt to erase. It was an attempt to re-link the memory to new information, that he had supported himself afterward, that he had not been entirely powerless, that others had been kind. The man practiced a short version of this, calling up a memory of the day he was let go, holding the image no more than a few breaths, then deliberately noting what happened after, how he found a neighbor who lent him a hand, how he survived. Over time, those corrective notes became part of the memory's soundtrack, and the fierce heat around it cooled. A caution was always present. The coach reminded him, if you have experienced severe trauma that continues to incapacitate you, seek trained professional support. Some memory work can be destabilizing if attempted alone. This script is not a substitute for clinical care. The man honored that boundary. He did not attempt deep reconsolidation without the coach's presence, and even then, they paced the work with rigorous attention to titration. He built rituals to hold the work, small invariants, a morning 5-minute breath check by the window, a letting go letter written each Sunday and then folded and placed in a drawer, not burned, not sent, just witnessed, a weekly inventory where he rated his energy, his sleep, his appetite, and listed 3 small experiments he would try the next week. These rituals became anchors. Rituals are not superstition. They are repeated signals to the nervous system that learning is happening here, steady and predictable. He tracked the small wins, applied for a role he never would have before, answered a friend's text, walked past an old coffee shop without collapsing into the loop of what-ifs. Each small experiment taught him that identity can be tested and revised. One experiment crystallized the idea of identity archaeology. The coach suggested an exercise. Imagine the identity you want in 3 areas: work, relationships, and self-care. Then list tiny behaviors that would fit that identity. If you want to be reliable, What does a reliable person do when someone asks for help? They respond within a reasonable time, they say what they can do, they follow through on one small promise. The man tried this. He made a single promise to a neighbor to water a plant. The promise was small, and the follow-through felt significant. He wrote down the sensation of proving his future self right.
This is how new neural pathways begin to thicken, repeated small acts that confirm a new story. Relationships demanded a different kind of work. In the past, he had conflated love with attachment, control with care. John Gottman's ideas about repair and attunement were translated into practical experiments. When someone expressed concern, he practiced staying present rather than clamoring for immediate fix. He learned boundaries, the gentle art in saying no when he needed to conserve energy, and saying yes when a small risk was called for. Differentiation, the coach said, is the capacity to be yourself in relationship without losing yourself in the other. It is a muscle grown through practice. The man's social world began to reform slowly. A friend from college called. He answered. An attempt at a new job produced rejection. He allowed disappointment to be present without narrating catastrophe. The protective structures loosened when they were replaced by new scaffolds, rituals, community, proof experiments. He was not transformed overnight. He was changed by accretion, the steady building where each small brick had been laid intentionally. There were relapses, weeks where old loops took over and the saboteur turned loud. Sometimes he retreated into the silence he knew, believing it safer than risk. Each relapse was a data point, not a verdict. He learned to meet himself with curiosity rather than contempt. The witness role became crucial in these moments. It didn't argue, it noticed. The protector learned that sometimes softening didn't mean being unguarded, but being strategic. You can stand guard while allowing a small light in. One evening, months into his practice, he walked past the old office building. It looked different in the gray wash of late afternoon. He felt a familiar tug in his chest, the old script of shame beginning to run. He paused and placed his hand over his ribs. He did 3 slow breath cycles and felt the tautness ease. He did not need to prove anything to anyone. He retraced his steps, taking a different route home, a small experiment to prove that he could walk near the thing that had once immobilized him without being swallowed by it. That night he wrote on his weekly inventory, walked past old office, felt anchored. The sentence was small, almost mundane, and it felt like a ledger of proof. Progress bred temptation. The more he could do, the more he feared the reappearance of the old world. If he rebuilt himself and then failed again, what would that mean? He recognized a pattern. Avoidance of risk had once protected him from pain. Now it threatened to prevent his new identity from ever testing its strength. The coach called this the paradox of safety. You must remain safe enough to learn and brave enough to be corrected by life. In sessions, they worked on calibration. How much risk? How little? The answer was never absolute. He learned to tier his experiments, small behavioral tests, sending a brief, honest message to a friend, applying for a role that felt slightly out of range, intentionally being on time for a call, each a micro-proof. He saved the big tests for after he'd practiced regulated presence and small wins repeatedly. This scaffolding is the difference between daring and simply jumping. The man's interior life changed in texture. Silence stopped feeling like a grave. It became occasionally useful as a place to listen. On evenings when he sat in it, he allowed the witness to notice sensations without narrating catastrophe. Silence could be a space to think, to breathe, to tone the system down. It was still heavy sometimes, but no longer immobilizing. There were still moments where the old identity, defined by failure, by loss, rose in a familiar rhythm. The phone ringing and his breath shortening, a social invitation, an immediate mental scripting of catastrophe. He practiced attending to the body, to parts, to breath. He practiced holding a memory only for a breath or two, and then grounding in the present. He practiced small kindnesses towards himself, calling a friend when he felt frayed, admitting when he needed help. Gradually, the pattern shifted from shouting to conversation. The work demanded a community. The coach introduced him to a small peer group, others who had been paused by loss and were practicing the same micro-experiments.
Shared witness mattered. It was not therapy in the clinical sense, but a scaffolding of accountability and human regulation. Being seen by people who were not looking to fix him, but to show up, steadied him. Brené Brown's work on vulnerability reframed these gatherings, not as exposures, but as exercises in trust, showing up imperfectly and being met without shaming. And then the calendar presented a test. A friend from his old workplace posted a photo of a retirement party, smiling faces around a table. A woman he had once loved posted a new life update, a picture of a dog and a caption about moving forward. These posts were small for outsiders, no deliberate provocation. For him, they were triggers, tiny sparks against dry tinder. His chest began to close. He felt the old script start to narrate itself, told again he had been left behind, that he was always last to choose. He felt it as a physical narrowing at the sternum, as though a belt had tightened. He knew the steps now. He could call the coach, he could breathe, he could write a brief note of noticing. But knowing and doing were sometimes separated by an ocean of thought. He sat with the phone, thumb hovering. The saboteur fed him worst-case narratives. The protector urged silence. The inner child wanted consolation. The witness sat quietly and asked a single question. What small action would confirm the identity you want to become? He chose a small action. He texted an old friend who had reached out months before and offered to meet for coffee. Just that.
A concrete, reachable commitment. His hands trembled after he hit send. He felt exposed. He felt like the old man who had once been abandoned, walking back into the room. But it was also one small proof. He did not yet know if the move would lead to a breakthrough. The story had not finished, new scaffolding. For now, he sat in the apartment and allowed the silence to be what it was, no more, no less. He placed a page in the drawer labeled Letting Go Letters, closed it, and replaced the mug in the cupboard. Outside, the city carried on. Inside, the man who had lost everything in silence was practicing being someone else, someone who could be hurt and still return to his life, someone who could speak a small truth and survive it. The work ahead was not linear, and the tests were not yet done. He had learned to tend to his nervous system, to speak kindly to his inner parts, to run experiments that proved new possibilities. The next time the old alarm sounded, he would be closer to an answer. He would have more tools. He would have a community. He would have the witness habit that could hold the surge long enough for a different choice to be made. Months folded into one another like pages turned slowly. The man learned that progress rarely felt like a tidy upward line. It looked instead like weather, sudden gusts, long stretches of calm, a storm that passed, and then a sun that returned. He continued his small rituals. He kept the 5-minute breath checks by the window, wrote his letting go letters on Sundays, and tracked tiny experiments in his weekly inventory. He began to notice not only what changed, but how his perception of change shifted. Where once he had waited for a single definitive sign, now he scanned for patterns, for accumulation. The coach invited deeper work when the scaffold felt sturdier. They approached a memory that had been a knot in his chest since the day he left the office for the last time. This wasn't an attempt to eradicate a trace, but to decrease the heat around it. They prepared the room. Soft lighting, a neutral object to orient attention, a stone on the table, and a plan for pacing. The coach reminded him of the rules. Small, brief activation, immediate introduction of corrective information, attention to the body. The safety language was explicit. If at any point the sensation rose beyond his capacity, they would stop. He trusted the plan because it was built on consent and microcalibration. He called the day he had been told he was no longer needed into the present just enough to feel its edges. The hum of fluorescent lights, the taste of burnt coffee, the words that landed like gravel. He held the image for only a few breaths, the way you might bring a hot cup close enough to notice its steam without burning your hands.
Then, deliberately, he named what had happened afterward, how he had managed the rent for 3 months, how a neighbor had offered him a temporary job helping move boxes, how a friend called and listened without fixing anything. These were small corrective facts, almost mundane, evidence that the story, "I am utterly alone," slowly the sharpness dulled. The memory remained, but the charge around it softened, like a photograph left in sunlight. Colors faded, but the outline stayed. The experience was not dramatic. There was no cinematic collapse or viral catharsis. There was a quiet easing, a loosening like fingers letting go of a rope. That easing mattered because it allowed him to act differently the next time a similar cue arrived. Science offers language for this: memory reconsolidation, neuroplasticity. But what he felt was practical: fewer automatic shutdowns, more room to choose. Even with these gains, the saboteur returned on difficult days with eloquent cruelty. It had a favorite script. It reminded him of every small misstep, every time he'd faltered. Sometimes the saboteur's voice was sourced in genuine uncertainty: medical bills, the unpredictability of freelance work, but much of its power came from habit. The coach taught a concrete way to interrupt that voice: curiosity inches rather than confrontation. When the saboteur spoke, he practiced inviting the witness to ask 3 simple questions. What is the evidence for that thought? What is the evidence against it? What small action would test which is truer? The process shifted the tone from moral failing to scientific inquiry. The inner voices still existed, but the witness created a context where they could speak without seizing control. Identity archaeology became one of his favorite practices because it felt like permitted imagination, the kind of play a child does before it becomes labeled irresponsible. The exercise began with small present tense sentences. I am someone who returns calls. I am someone who keeps a promise to himself. I am someone who notices and names what he feels. For each sentence, he listed one micro-behavior that would prove the claim. Return one message within 24 hours. Sleep and wake at consistent times for 3 days. Check his breath when the chest tightened. These were not grand vows. They were tests, daily experiments that would either support or disconfirm the hypothesis that his identity could change. He also wrote letters, not the letting go ones that were folded into drawers, but letters from a future self. He imagined himself 2 years ahead and wrote in present tense about what that person did differently.
The future self was specific. He walked to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings. He said no to a committee that drained him. He replied to a friend's text the same day. Writing these letters did more than generate hope. It provided material evidence for his nervous system. The brain responds to narrative. When you tell a different story about what is possible, pathways begin to shape in the direction of the new plot. Those experiments demanded courage because they required exposure to possibility as well as to failure. He learned to treat failure as data rather than as a verdict. When a prove-it test slipped, he missed a call, he forgot a commitment, he put the result into the inventory without judgment and planned a smaller, kinder repeat. Rehearsal replaced shame as the primary response. Relationships remained perhaps the trickiest terrain. Letting go inside did not automatically fix patterns of attachment. Old habits of reactivity surfaced in conversations with friends and in dating. He noticed how his body anticipated abandonment, a tightening at the throat, a quickening of breath, an impulse either to withdraw or to demand reassurance. He practiced a new muscular skill, differentiation, by staying present in small interactions, in labeling his internal experience rather than projecting it outward. When a date did not reply for 2 days, he did not spin into catastrophe. Instead, he sent one brief message aligned with his capacity. Hey, hope all's well. If you want to reschedule, I'm free next Tuesday. That short, steady step was evidence of a different contract he had made with himself. He also learned to ask for repair. When misattunement happened, a flippant comment from a friend that stung, he practiced a 2-step process. Name what happened. When you said X, I noticed Y in my chest. And request reparation. I'd like to say what I need and hear if that feels possible for you. These were not heavy demands. They were calibrations. John Gottman's ideas about repair attempts were useful here. Relationships do not require perfection. They require the ability to notice rupture and to engage in small acts that recount care. Sometimes the friend met him, sometimes they didn't. In either case, the work was about recalibrating his expectations about safety in small moments, rather than building a global rule. Community became a scaffolding he had not predicted he would value so concretely. The peer group the coach recommended met weekly. Members arrived with modest homework, a micro-experiment to report, a snag they'd encountered, a ritual they'd tried. The group did not fix his life. It did something subtle and essential. It made him habituated to being seen imperfectly and not being crushed. The shared witness became a regulated social environment. He watched others stumble and return. He offered compassion, and importantly, allowed others to offer him steadiness without pressure to perform. Work life shifted in increments.
He did not walk into a dream job. He took roles that fit his new energy and capacity. He took a part-time position at a small nonprofit where the expectations were clear and the culture was steady. There he practiced saying no, asking for clarity, and showing up in ways that matched his values. Each small responsibility kept his promises to himself. The job did not erase his losses. It replaced some of the empty spaces they had left with purpose and predictable routines. Purpose, he discovered, is a quiet discipline. It isn't always thrilling, but it is steadying. Relapse continued to arrive in stealth forms, an offhand remark that halved his appetite for risk, a throwback photo that made him feel smaller. One particularly sharp relapse happened at a holiday dinner where family dynamics triggered a long embedded shame script. He felt the old warmth of the silence like a safety blanket and considered retreat. For an hour, he cycled through old strategies, tolerating the emotional ache, minimizing, smiling. Then, in the middle of mashed potatoes and polite chatter, he felt the witness notice the tightening in his chest and urge a different move. Name it aloud, gently. He said, "I'm feeling a little numb right now. I'll step outside for a minute." His family's response was ordinary but functional. Someone asked if he wanted a dog walk later. Another asked if he wanted a cup of tea. The small naming did not erase the pain, but it diffused escalation. He returned to the table 10 minutes later with a softer chest. It was a small experiment in getting help instead of collapsing into a private silence. The man learned that letting others hold parts of his load did not require him to become less autonomous. In fact, it increased his capacity to carry risk. Co-regulation, the practice of using others' regulated presence to soothe your nervous system, turned out to be not a sign of weakness, but of smart adaptation. The coach modeled this repeatedly: a calm voice, steady breathing, a simple phrase like "you're here" that allowed the body to accept safety signals. He practiced being that presence in return for others, and in doing so, he strengthened networks of reciprocity. There was an aesthetic change in his apartment. He kept the mug, but he bought a second plant and learned to water it on schedule. He arranged a chair by the window for deliberate reading. These were minor acts, decor by some metric, but they were rehearsals in valuing his days. He stopped telling himself that ease was a sin or a sign of complacency. He treated it as an earned condition. Quiet didn't mean stagnation. Sometimes silence was repair. He encountered a series of invitations that required bravery. One was a community talk about resilience offered by the nonprofit where he worked. He could have declined. He had the old script ready. What if I'm exposed? What if someone sees me as damaged? What if I freeze? He remembered the identity experiments and chose instead a small variation. He accepted but limited the scope. He agreed to speak for 10 minutes about a single practice, coherent breathing, and to include one micro-story about his own missteps. Preparing the talk was a rehearsal in public vulnerability. When the night came, the hall was small, the chairs warm, the lighting forgiving. He spoke with an evenness he had not earlier imagined. He didn't perform resilience, he described it, its daily habits, its slow accrual. Afterward, someone approached and said, "I did the breath practice, and it helped me come down into my chest." The exchange was brief but transformative. It demonstrated that the very vulnerability he feared could be an offering, not a risk that swallowed him. Then came the unexpected test that would form the narrative's crucial pivot. Several months after leaving his old job, Michael received an email inviting him to a casual reunion, an alumni event for the company where he'd once felt so small. He debated attending. The old self whispered that he would only look smaller in the presence of those who had watched him fall away. The new self weighed evidence. Small exposures had yielded learning. The event was optional and modest. He chose to go, imagining the identity he wanted to inhabit, someone who attends without being consumed. The room at the reunion was a humid, fluorescent rectangle. Faces settled into old patterns of recognition. People asked the old questions. "So what are you doing?" And he had practiced succinct answers that were true and bounded. "I work with a small nonprofit on community programs. We're building neighborhood workshops." He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, he returned to microbehaviors, steady eye contact, measuring breath, letting pauses exist without filling them.
Halfway through the evening, someone from his old team, someone he had once respected, made a careless joke about career trajectories, a barb about those who couldn't hack the corporate climb. The room laughed. It was a small spear for an old shame. Heat rose in his chest. The saboteur whispered the usual assault. You still don't measure up. You're behind. The protector urged silence. His palms went a shade damp. The old reflex would have been to leave in humiliation, to fold back into silence and let the story tighten into new proof. But he had rehearsed for this. He felt the chest tighten and initiated coherent breathing. A slow, measured inhale through the nose, an exhale extended just a beat longer. He named internally, witness. I noticed shame in the chest. The words were private, a soft anchor. He did not ruminate on the old narrative. Instead, he asked a small experimental question. What small action aligns with the identity I want? He could either exit and confirm the old pattern of retreat, or he could speak with a calm boundary. He chose a third movement, short, clear, and safe.
He turned to the man who had made the joke and, without accusation, said, I used to measure my worth by those metrics. Now I measure by whether my work helps people feel held. The voice was steady, light on indignation. He didn't ask for an apology. He merely changed the frame of the conversation. The room shifted. Some people blinked, some laughed awkwardly and moved on. The man who had scoffed shifted his stance, and a friend in the room offered a quick, bridging comment. That's real work. No triumph, no close, just a steadying of the field. Afterward, a woman he hadn't known well approached him and said, I'm glad you said that. She introduced herself as someone who had been in a similar situation years ago. They spoke for 10 minutes about nonprofit work, about the difficulty of transitions, and about a practice she'd found helpful, pairing micro-actions with a ritual of closure when a day ended. The encounter was unremarkable in plot, but rich in consequence. He left the room without the hollowed feeling of humiliation. He had acted in accordance with a new story, and the story received evidence. The moment was not flawless. Inside, the saboteur still darted his mouth with snarky counterarguments, but the witness kept space for them without capitulation. The man had, in effect, created a new script for the scene. Respond calmly, set a boundary if it felt right, and choose connection where possible. The old reflex of private collapse had been interrupted. That evening, he recorded the event in his weekly inventory. He wrote 3 things: the trigger, the practice he used, and the small result. The exercise felt like ledger work in a bank of change. Over time, the entries accumulated into a narrative of competence. The inventory became proof against the saboteur's cruel axioms. When the real tests came later, losses small and large, they no longer undid him. He experienced grief and disappointment in ways that were metabolized rather than ossified. A potential apartment fell through. A friend moved far away. A project stalled. Each loss activated familiar sensations, but now he had ways to move through them. He breathed. He engaged the parts work and listened to the protector's fear without letting it command the whole house. He did not fetishize resilience. He honored the ache and then acted toward a plan, however small. Part of his reconstruction involved returning to creativity. He had once loved to write short essays, lines of observation he never published. As his inner weather brightened some days, he started to write again, not to prove anything to the world, but to claim a habit he had once abandoned. He wrote about small things: the copper taste of a late winter wind, the quiet satisfaction of a plant's new leaf. Writing forced him to name experience without collapsing into global narratives. He began to submit an essay to a local magazine, and to his surprise, received a polite acceptance.
The acceptance was not celebratory, but it mattered. A small external confirmation that his inner life could cohere into external action. Spirituality, when it appeared in his work, was optional and porous. Sometimes he felt a sense of connection, an expansiveness on long walks that felt like a softening around the edges. He did not import dogma or demand miracles. He allowed for moments where meaning increased without needing to be explained. Some nights he sat in silence and felt held by something larger than his anxious loops. Other nights he cataloged facts and reformulated strategies. Both were credible and useful. Safety remained paramount. As they did deeper reconsolidation exercises, the coach reiterated that some work is best done with licensed clinicians for those with severe, complex trauma. The man respected that boundary. He never tried to be his own surgeon. He worked with people who could read the subtle signs of destabilization and who would pause work at the first sign of overload. This ethical safekeeping was an essential lesson. Rebuilding does not mean reckless excavation. Time did not eliminate the memory of the losses. He still remembered, sometimes vividly, the precise cadence of the boss's dismissal, or the last sentence his partner said to him. What changed was the relationship to those memories. They were chapters, some pages tattered, some ink blurred, but they no longer defined the entirety of his library. As the months turned toward a full year since the deepest rupture, his life had new contours. He made commitments he would have avoided before: a standing coffee with a neighbor, a small volunteer role coordinating supply drives, an application to a part-time fellowship that required a short talk. He still made mistakes. He still had nights of low mood, and mornings when getting out of bed felt like weightlifting. But the default response to those mornings changed. He no longer assumed catastrophe. He assumed process and gentle experiment. The work coalesced into a pattern of 3 habits that became his backbone. First, regulation, regular breath work, movement, and attention to the body's signals. Second, testing, micro-experiments that proved identity and adjusted expectations. Third, community, habits of relational practice, repair, and shared witness. These habits were small enough to repeat daily and robust enough to carry him through harder weather. They were, in essence, a manual he had written for himself in the margins of life. One of the most instructive moments came when he mentored a new peer in the group. The person was freshly bereaved of the job. They confessed shame and a crushing silence that resembled the early days of his own loss. He listened, not as an expert, but as someone who had navigated similar rocks. He taught one of the simplest tools: 3 slow breaths before responding to a triggering email. He sat with the person and modeled the breath.
The person exhaled and said, "I didn't think a breath could make that much of a difference." He answered, "It's not magic. It's repetition. It's like training your palms to carry a bowl of soup without spilling." The metaphor landed. They both laughed softly. He felt gratitude for the circuit of giving and receiving that community work created. There were days when he encountered old friends who asked, almost casually, "Are you all better now?" He found himself composing answers that were accurate rather than performative. He would say something like, "I'm different. I still miss a lot, and I still get triggered. I have more tools now, though, and more people to practice with." The responses from others were usually kind. Sometimes they were neutral. He learned to accept this too. The world does not always mirror your inner adjustments, and that was fine. His work was not primarily to change the world, but to change the way he lived in it. Financial stability remained incremental. The nonprofit job became steady enough to cover rent and to allow saving a small emergency fund. Money, he discovered, was less a destination than a base camp. He still tracked expenses carefully, used the weekly inventory to notice how money stress affected his sleep and appetite, and applied the same experimental logic. What small spending or saving habit would sustain his nervous system better? He found that aligning finances with values, spending less on impulse, donating a small portion to a cause that mattered, created a sense of integrity that also soothed anxiety. The man formed a ritual for endings that proved surprisingly powerful. On any day when he felt a tension about closure, an ending of a chapter in relationships, jobs, or projects, he wrote a brief account of the chapter's arc, and then performed a small ritual of transition, folding the paper, placing it in a drawer, lighting a candle for a minute, or sending a short email to the person involved acknowledging a truth. These rituals were not theatrical. They served as boundary signals to his nervous system, punctuating the day and allowing him to move forward with less residue. Rituals, he learned, are not about formal mystique. They are communication to your body that something is concluded. As time wore on, his friends noticed a change, not a dramatic rebirth with fanfare, but a steadier presence, someone who laughed in ways that were not protective, someone who could hold contradictions without dissolving into a tale of failure. His neighbors asked if he would lead a short breathing circle at the community center. He agreed, again keeping scope small and clear, and found himself surprised by the simplicity of the gift. People arrived, many of them wear and worn. He offered 3 practices they could use immediately, and explained why each mattered, always returning the explanation to simple experiential terms.
After the circle, someone stayed to tell him that the breathwork helped with a panic attack she'd had for years. He did not feel like a savior. He felt like a connector, someone who'd learned to pass along practical tools that settled the body enough to open a new possibility. There were also moments of quiet joy. Walking late one spring night, he stopped at a small bench in the park and watched a couple of teenagers practicing a music routine. He felt an unanticipated swell of contentment, permission to be present with simple beauty. He realized that the vocabulary of his life had changed. He noticed ordinary pleasures without needing to annotate them with fear. Toward the end of the second year, a friend proposed a small collaborative project, an online series where community members shared micro-practices for regulation. He hesitated at first. The old cautionary voice murmured concerns about exposure and credibility. But the new habit of micro-experimentation prompted a different question. What small contribution could he make that required little upfront perfection, but had potential collective value? He agreed to present a short segment on titration and memory work, with a clear safety guideline and resource list. The episode was modest, no celebrity guests, no viral hooks, but the feedback was earnest. Several viewers wrote privately to say that the piece helped them try a breath exercise or seek a clinician. For him, the modest reach felt like an affirmation of slow, steady generosity. There remained beneath practical routines a philosophical shift. He now understood freedom as a sustained practice rather than a single achievement. Freedom was not the moment when the past ceased to matter. It was the accumulation of choices that narrowed the past's ability to define the present. He sometimes thought of that original silence in the apartment, and how it had once felt like a verdict. Now, silence could be the place where he listened to the witness, where he drafted letters without sending them, where he let the chest loosen in breathwork. Silence had been repurposed from a cell into a tool. The climax of his arc was not a solitary cinematic triumph, but an integrated test where multiple skills converged. That test came unexpectedly. A person from his past, someone who had contributed to both the job loss and the relational decline, reappeared in his life. They reached out with a message that carried an old sting and an implied apology. The message was tentative and complex: curiosity, a hint of regret, and a request for a conversation. The man felt the familiar wrench, the body primed to rehearse the evidence of harm, the protector urging caution, the inner child longing for reconciliation. This was a scenario he had rehearsed in parts. It required regulation, boundaries, witness, and a capacity to test new identity in real time. He paused for a full day before responding.
He wrote drafts, practiced breathing, and consulted his weekly inventory to feel whether his capacity matched the ask. He reached out to a friend in his peer group and described the situation. They offered co-regulation, practical suggestions, and an invitation to meet briefly in public if he chose to reply. He took the friend's presence as a scaffold. The day of the meeting, he did coherent breathing before leaving the house, named the parts likely to arise: protector, saboteur, inner child, and invited the witness to hold the whole room. He prepared a clear personal boundary in advance. He would attend the conversation for 30 minutes and would leave if he felt his chest begin to seal. They met on a mild afternoon at a cafe. The person who had reached out took a seat with visible discomfort. They spoke with halting honesty about what had happened, offered apologies that were neither grand nor evasive, and described their own learning. The man listened with the witness active, noting bodily sensations and letting them be signals rather than commands. When old accusations surfaced in his mind, he named them silently and then asked a clarifying question rather than launching into a monologue. He practiced a small reclaiming. When the conversation veered toward blame, he said, "I'm not here to make this a relitigation of old hurts. I'm here to understand and to set boundaries if needed." The tone contained no theatrical magnanimity, only plainness. At one moment, the person said something that would have once rendered him helpless, a dismissive remark that skimmed over the impact of their actions. Heat rose in his chest. He felt the reflex to declare his pain loudly. Instead, he did 3 slow breath cycles, felt the chest ease a fraction, and then asked for one concrete corrective. "Can you name one specific thing you hear me say now about the impact?" The person had to slow down and answer. The exchange required the other person to be specific and accountable in a way they hadn't been before. The conversation did not conclude with a cinematic reconciliation. It concluded with a pact to try small repairs and a mutual agreement to give each other space. He left the cafe with a few new facts in his pocket, an apology that had some edges, a commitment to a single small act of reparation, and the knowledge that he could sit in proximity to an old wound without being swallowed by it. That conversation proved a practical crucible. He had used breath, parts work, boundaries, and community support. He had entered an uncertain interaction with limits and a plan rather than with survival instincts. The result was not perfect closure, but it was integration, a new pattern confirmed in the lived world. The old alarm still sometimes sounded afterward, but each time the charge dimmed more quickly. The memory of harm had not disappeared. Its power to organize his life had diminished.
Months later, in a small moment that would have once been impossible, he found himself sitting in a different apartment, light and lived in, making tea, the plant on the windowsill flourishing. He had a new routine, a short morning walk, a journal entry, a note to a friend. He had rebuilt financial habits slowly and had enough savings to weather small storms. He had new friends who were not caretakers but co-practitioners. He had small rituals that marked endings and beginnings. Most important, he had a relationship with himself that allowed for both grief and growth. He acknowledged the losses without letting them dictate the plot of his life. His reconstruction was not about erasing what happened. It was about creating a life where the old losses could sit in a windowed room rather than in the center of every decision. He had found a way to hold pain and possibility simultaneously. He had learned to notice the body first and the story later, to titrate exposure rather than flood the system, to test identity in tiny increments, and to invite others into regulated presence rather than living alone in silence. If someone asked him for a single piece of advice, he would offer it as an invitation rather than a prescription. Start with the breath and the smallest possible experiment. Begin with one tiny habit that signals to your body and your brain that something is being learned. A breath taken with attention is not a magic cure, but it is a practice that tells your nervous system a new story, that you can endure discomfort and still return. Pair that with one small behavioral test, a returned call, a short conversation, a walk past an old place, and track it. Build scaffolding, a safe person, a routine, and a community to witness the work. Do not expect overnight transformation. Expect the slow power of accretion. He did not become untouchable. He was not immune to sorrow. But when sorrow arrived now, it arrived as a visitor rather than as a judge. The silence that once swallowed him had been repurposed into a tool he could use, a place to rest, to plan, to hold witness. He had lost everything in silence once, and then, by deliberately practicing the small things other people often dismiss as trivial, he rebuilt a life that could actively contain the past. This is not a template that guarantees the same outcome for everyone. People's histories, resources, and capacities differ. If you have experienced severe trauma that continues to incapacitate you, seek trained professional support. The techniques he used, coherent breathing, titration, parts work, reconsolidation, are tools best practiced with appropriate guidance when trauma is deep. Yet for many who carry the weight of loss quietly, there is an invitation here. Practical practices, paced and repeated, can shift the relationship to pain. He learned that rebuilding is not about erasing scars, but about increasing the space in which they can exist without dictating every movement.
He lived with the knowledge that the past would sometimes call, but he did not have to answer by rewinding old stories. He could answer with a breath, a boundary, a small experiment, and a person to call. The man who lost everything in silence had, over time, rewritten his inner script. He had not disappeared into triumphalism. He had accumulated evidence, small acts repeated, that supported a different identity. Freedom, for him, became a practice of steady attention, of making small promises and keeping them, of inviting others to be present without demanding perfection. He learned how to cultivate a baseline of safety and to use that baseline to test, gently, the edges of his world. If you find resonance in his story, consider one small starting point today, one measured breath, one micro-action that aligns with who you want to become, and one person you can ask to be a steady witness. Incremental steps, taken consistently, are the mortar in the slow building of a new life. If you want the practical checklist and guided exercises he used, the breathing scripts, the titration prompts, the identity archaeology worksheet, download the Letting Go toolkit linked below. It contains the small, repeatable practices that supported his rebuilding. Presented as invitations, you can adapt to your circumstance.